Welcome to Rappaport Connects, where we interview notable Rappaport Foundation fellows and alumni. My name is Sean Horrigan. Today, we're joined by 2025 Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston Public Policy Fellow, Christopher Baidoo. Christopher holds a Bachelor of Social Work from James Madison University, a Master of Social Work from Indiana University, and a JD from California Western School of Law. He is currently a doctoral candidate at Boston College School of Social Work, where his research focuses on how public policy affects marginalized populations. He was recently selected as one of 12 recipients of the 2025 Harry Frank Guggenheim Emerging Scholar Awards, which supports dissertation research on violence across areas like policing, political extremism, and social conflict. Christopher, welcome to Rappaport Connects, and congratulations on the award.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Christopher, what does receiving that kind of recognition mean for you at this point in your PhD journey? And does it change your direction at all, or mostly reinforce what you were already focused on?
Well, I think it was particularly meaningful to me as an early career researcher. To me, it motivates me to continue doing this type of research. I think having an organization as prominent as the Harry F. Guggenheim Foundation, that if that kind of organization can see value in the work that I'm doing and its ability to move the dial on these violence-related issues, that was impactful to me. I don't really think it changes my direction. If anything, it underscores the work that I'm already doing. The idea that you can conduct this type of research that asks these big, potentially controversial questions that have the potential to significantly impact lives, to me, that's powerful. And receiving the award allowed me to dedicate my full effort to examining these issues and fostering future work that builds off of what I'm doing in my dissertation.
What part of your work do you think stood out most to them?
I think it was potentially the significance and the timeliness of the topic. So my dissertation evaluates how 3 legal interventions influence fatal police-civilian interactions and associated racial and ethnic disparities, the results of which I think could potentially save lives. I think given national attention in recent years to police violence, I mean, we've seen, for example, the very public murder of George Floyd by a white Minneapolis police officer, that there have been calls for legal reforms to prevent such deaths. So I think the potential significance of the work, the timeliness of the work, and also the idea that I was examining structures and systems that have the potential to foster real change and can move the dial on these really big issues. I think those were potentially things that stood out.
Fantastic. What drew you to this work initially?
I was really drawn to this based on current events and the history of racially and ethnically disparate policing and outcomes in the criminal legal system. You know, as I was kind of mentioning, that we've really seen publicly these police killings in recent years. I think especially with the proliferation of video documentation of fatal police encounters, and we saw global protests about race-based policing in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. And so we saw this push for legal reforms to change policing. I mean, after George Floyd's murder, there were over 100 police reform bills that were introduced in state legislatures in the US. So although it's possible that these legal interventions can reduce fatalities and associated racial and ethnic disparities, there's been surprisingly little empirical research examining these possibilities. So I saw this as a ripe area for investigation, given its timeliness, novelty, and potential for big impact.
Christopher, when you're looking at legislation, court rulings, and policy changes, how do you decide what counts as meaningful reform versus something more symbolic or incremental?
I think to determine whether reform translates into meaningful change, you have to perform evaluative empirical research, which could include using inferential statistics to examine the effects of reforms. I think another piece of this is in assessing whether meaningful reform has occurred, we have to examine how the law or policy impacts outcomes across the criminal process. So it could be that a law or legal intervention impacts arrests or police use of force, but not fatal police encounters. So just because we don't see impact across the criminal process doesn't mean that a reform is ineffective. And even if there isn't meaningful reform or change, there are normative and, as you indicated, symbolic reasons for a law. So, for example, even if we don't see changes in policing as the result of marijuana legalization, legalization may be justifiable given the racially and ethnically disparate history of drug enforcement in the United States, which many legislatures have identified as a motivating factor in legalization. So there might be these normative, symbolic reasons in addition to looking at actual meaningful reform.
Has your thinking about policing and racial disparities changed since you started your doctoral work?
I think my thinking has become more nuanced. I think having conducted 3 quasi-experimental studies looking at legal interventions and their impact on fatal police encounters, my results revealed that outcomes are variable by intervention and across populations. They're not these one-size-fits-all solutions, that sometimes effects vary by racial and ethnic group and vary over time. They also revealed how structures like laws and legal interventions can influence racially disparate outcomes like fatal encounters. And I think many people believe that police are biased, and that's why we see these racially disparate outcomes in the criminal legal system. And I'm not saying that that's not true in some instances, but I don't think it reflects the full picture of what's happening, that we also have these systems and structures in place that impact outcomes, that even if we were to correct for all of these individual level biases that you might have among the police force, you might still have racially disparate outcomes because we haven't addressed the larger systemic issues at play, like laws and policies and practices. So if we can change the structures, we can see reductions in fatal encounters, and associated racial and ethnic disparities may also evolve as well.
Do you think most policing reforms fall short because of how they're designed, or because we're still missing something about what actually drives violence and harm in the first place?
I think in some ways there are multiple issues involved. I think sometimes it's design. I think sometimes there are implementation issues, and sometimes there are issues of scope, and also factors that drive police civilian interaction. So sometimes reforms fall short because of implementation issues, such as, the actual reform itself might be effective, but if the police force is not receptive to the reform and are not implementing the reform, we may not see actual reform because there's a resistant policing or supervisory culture. It could also be that the scope of the reform is just not broad enough. So any one reform in isolation may not be enough to move the dial in isolation. So we might need collective reforms in order to realize actual change. I think also, to your point, I think there's been less focus on some of the drivers of police contact, which are admittedly very large scale issues, like preventing poverty is a big issue, which can drive police contact, which can drive crime. And obviously, there are many downstream effects of poverty in addition to criminal legal system contact. I mean, so for example, there's some research that has linked Medicaid expansion such that states increase income thresholds for coverage. So states that have expanded Medicaid, that there are reductions in crime, that there are reductions in arrests and rearrests. So there is less police civilian contact, which impacts my research in the dissertation, which is looking at fatal police encounters. So I think as researchers, we've focused less on these big scale, what brings a police civilian interaction to bear, and we've focused less on those big picture ideas. So I mean, it's a kind of a long way of answering your question, that I think it's everything. I mean, I think it's we haven't focused on some of the drivers, and there are implementation issues, there are scope issues. But I mean, I would also point out that there is evidence of some effective police reform. So it's not that all police reforms have been ineffective. But I mean, I just think we have to take a more wholesome view of police reform. And there are things that work, there are things that don't. Yeah.
You were a 2025 Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston Public Policy Fellow, where you worked in child protection policy. How does that background shape how you think about state intervention in policing and public safety?
One thing that I learned as a Rappaport Public Policy Fellow was the importance of connecting with policymakers and those on the ground that implement policy. And I think academic research often exists in a vacuum and is consumed by other academics, but it doesn't always make it to policymakers and is certainly not written in a way to induce change. So one thing that I hope to do with this research that I've been conducting is to translate my findings into accessible op-eds or policy briefs, which could be 1 to 2 pager documents on key findings written in layman's terms. And then to get these policy briefs into the hands of policymakers to be able to drive the change indicated by the findings. And hopefully this translation of the findings and connections with those in power or with the ability to make change can actually drive reforms in policing.
Could you share some of those key findings in layman's terms for us now?
Yeah, so I looked at 3 what I'm calling legal interventions. So they are elimination of qualified immunity for police officers, legalization of recreational marijuana, and federal intervention in local police departments. And for each intervention, I found that at least for some populations that they were effective in driving down fatal police encounters, and in some instances, racial and ethnic disparities. So there is some evidence that states that have eliminated qualified immunity for police officers, that there are fewer fatal encounters, or that rates of fatal encounters go down for some populations, that states that have legalized recreational marijuana, that there are in turn fewer fatal encounters, and among some groups, fewer racial and ethnic disparities in those encounters. And then among police agencies that have been intervened upon by the Federal Department of Justice. And so the Federal Department of Justice can intervene in police departments with pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. And so my research has indicated that federal intervention can drive down fatal police encounters and racial and ethnic disparities among some populations. So, I mean, I think across these 3 studies in the dissertation, there is evidence that these interventions can be effective in reducing rates of fatal police civilian encounters and, in some instances, racial and ethnic disparities. So these interventions can work, can be effective, and I think my findings demonstrate that.
Do you see these interventions being implemented at all currently, or is that something you hope is going to happen down the line?
It's a patchwork. So among states that have eliminated qualified immunity for police officers, I mean, there are just a handful of states that have. There was some momentum in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder for states to eliminate qualified immunity. There were several bills introduced, but there's been limited momentum in recent years. So I think it would be ideal if other states did, but I realistically don't see that happening. These findings, though, I think can provide some evidence to help support eliminating qualified immunity in addition to prior research that has been done for recreational marijuana legalization. I mean, that's a big issue. I mean, it obviously impacts more than just fatal police encounters. So we see, though, every few years that there are additional states that have legalized recreational use of marijuana. And of course, there are myriad issues that are impacted by legalization beyond just policing. And for federal intervention, that really is dependent on federal administration. We've seen with Democratic administrations that intervention increases, with Republican administrations that intervention decreases. So it really depends on who's in power, whether federal intervention is actually used as a tool to hold police agencies accountable.
Are police departments in municipalities open to hearing this type of feedback?
I think it depends. We've certainly seen instances of some departments that are willing to see this kind of evidence and hear this kind of evidence on police reform. And we've certainly seen the opposite, that there are police agencies and cities that are resistant to having external forces come in and do an analysis on their work. But for example, we've seen in Minneapolis. So Minneapolis was subject to federal intervention by the Department of Justice, and this was in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder in 2020. And the Department of Justice came in, they did an investigation. The Department of Justice and the city entered into an agreement that would require significant police reform. When the Trump administration came into office, they canceled that agreement. So the city was no longer subject to this agreement with the Department of Justice. But the city indicated that, hey, we still believe that we need to reform our policing practices. So even in the absence of federal intervention, we want to reform. We realize that there are problems in our policing practices. So, I mean, that's just an example of, well, sometimes police agencies are willing to evolve, are willing to have external agencies come in and are willing to evolve their policing practices to be in compliance with federal law and the Constitution.
Christopher, as you look ahead, what comes next after graduation? What's your career trajectory?
So I will publish these dissertation studies in academic journals and hope to build on my findings in future research. And as I was indicating, I mean, I think in addition to just publishing these in academic journals, I would hope to translate the findings into digestible, accessible bites of information that can be given to policymakers to inform future legislative efforts, to hopefully have these findings impact policy. So publish my dissertation, build on the dissertation findings by examining other understudied interventions that could impact policing. I'm also in the process of seeking academic, postdoctoral, and tenure track faculty positions to enable me to continue this research, to build a research agenda that continues to evaluate policy and informs equitable policing and public safety.
Well, I see great things ahead for you and look forward to watching what comes next. Christopher Baidoo, thank you so much for joining us on Rappaport Connects.
Thank you for having me.